An exception handler consists of two core blocks. The try block encloses some code which might throw an exception. The catch block contains the error handling code determining what should be done if an error is detected. Here is an example which demonstrates the try-catch block. In this example, I have added a try-catch block to the previous example. In the previous example, you have seen the JVM throwing a runtime error message at the statement 27 divided by D. In this example, we will handle the runtime exception and prevent the program from an abnormal termination. This is the catch block, which catches the arithmetic exception and prints the message you cannot divide an integer by 0. And then the control moves out of the catch block, printing the message after the catch block. There comes the output. There are two things that I want you to remember. One, the statement after exception statement are never executed. For example, the statement that prints "this will not be printed" will not execute. However, if the value of D was not 0, then the statement at line 7 would not have resulted in an exception, allowing the statement at line 8 to execute. And then the second point is that the catch block is executed only if there was an exception. Try catch block. Any code that could result in an exception should be placed in a try block. The catch block should contain the code that will execute only when an exception is thrown. A try block can have multiple catch blocks. If an exception is thrown in the try block, execution control jumps to the catch block and then executes linearly. Multiple catch blocks. You may also choose to have multiple catch blocks to handle all exceptions separately. However, they should handle the exceptions as per the exception hierarchy. That is, the last block should handle the exception of the most generic class, generally the exception class. If you put a catch block that handles the superclass exception above the one that handles the subclass exception, the compiler complains that the exception has already been caught. We'll soon see an example of how to use multiple catch blocks. Here is an example which demonstrates how to use multiple catch blocks. In this example, I am using a command line argument to capture the name of the file, as you see here at line 4. The statement at line 4, args of 0, could result in an array index out of bounds exception if the user does not pass the command line argument or file name. And therefore, I included a catch block to handle the array index out of bounds exception. And then I am handling the file not found exception to make sure that my program does not go for an abnormal termination if the file name passed as command line argument was not found in the current path. And finally, I have a catch block of exception class. This can be used as a more generic way of handling the exception. As discussed in the previous slide, if you try placing the generic handler at line 14 to 16 before the array index handler, the compiler would throw a compile time error saying the exception was already been caught. This is because the JVM looks for the first catch block which can hold the exception object thrown due to an abnormal condition. And therefore, the later blocks would however not be reached. So make sure that you always have the more specific handler blocks before the more generic handler blocks, as seen in this example. To run this program, use the command java class name followed by the command line argument, which is the file name with the file extension. Finally block. The finally block executes irrespective of an exception being thrown or not. Thus, it is ideally used for closing the resources such as file handlers or database connections acquired during the execution of the method. The only situation when finally will not be executed is when the JVM shuts down. Here is an example of how to create a finally block. The finally block is the last executed block. Try and finally blocks. Finally blocks can also be written with a try block without any catch blocks. However, there can be only one finally block per try block. Here is an example where I have a try block which could have some risky code. And here comes the finally block. Please note that finally blocks are not meant for exception handling. They execute irrespective of an exception.